Great. On this next session, we have a really interesting product from Outbreaker Solutions. Today, Matt Hodgson is joining us. Welcome, Matt.
Hi, Erin. Thanks so much for having me.
So I've been doing a little bit of reading about your products, but perhaps if you can introduce yourself and how you got into this line of products would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm one of the co-founders of Outbreaker Solutions, and we're a Canadian biotech startup company. I'm here in Edmonton, Alberta, on the west coast of Canada. And we initially started down this path of investigating how salt can be used as an antimicrobial touch surface several years ago. It actually started with one of my fellow co-founders, Braden Whitlock, who randomly met the inventor of this product when he started describing that he used pieces of salt from animal salt licks, those big 50-pound blocks that were, if you have an agricultural background, may be familiar with. And he had gotten some testing done, and it showed that when bacteria are placed on the actual piece of salt, that it very rapidly is killed. And Braden was doing his undergrad in science at the time and became very intrigued by that. And we both had some entrepreneurial ambitions. So we eventually formed a partnership with the inventor and began trying to build out the company around Outbreaker Solutions. And that really had multiple parts that we are still developing and trying to bring to market. One of the first parts was actually going through the patenting process with this product. So our company owns patents that deal with the use of sodium chloride as an antimicrobial agent on hand contact devices. And then after we were able to get through that process, which took quite a few years, if you're familiar with how long sometimes patenting can take, we wanted to really focus on building out the research behind the product, because we learned early on there isn't and wasn't basically any published literature about how salt could be used in this way, especially when it comes to those all-important efficacy numbers of how fast acting the product is. And that's where Braden's research background and experience and connections with the University of Alberta here in Edmonton really played a key role. And I can talk a little bit about some of those publications a little bit later. And then outside of the patent and the science, of course, moving forward on developing prototypes and trying to actually commercialize different applications with salt. And we've made a lot of strides in that area, because we're dealing with this, even though salt's been around for thousands and thousands of years, using it in this way is a relatively novel feature. So we're still having to explore certain ways of making products, but we've made some good progress, and I'll share some images here as well.
Brilliant. Well, it sounds like quite a journey so far. I'm very excited to hear more about this.
Absolutely. So maybe I can share up my presentation here and talk through a bit of this. So basically, our company really set out to try to help prevent the spread of common pathogens on hand-to-hand contact surfaces. Now, of course, over the last 18 months, we're living through this little pandemic called COVID-19, which is primarily a respiratory virus, of course, but most infections, the vast majority of them, are actually spread by our hands, right? We pick up some sort of infection, and then we're really bad at keeping our fingers out of our noses and mouths. So we touch some kind of mucus or saliva, and we touch something else. Somebody comes along a minute later, picks it up, and this vicious cycle of infections really continue. And this is particularly a really large problem in the healthcare space with hospital-acquired infections. And we're seeing the resistance of bacteria to a lot of antibiotics, which, according to governments and other healthcare institutions, this is one of the bigger threats to healthcare over the next several decades, is the growing resistance to antibiotics. So it's really important that a number of different products come to market that help combat the spread of these infections. And that's what we're all about with our product. So we've been focused very heavily on expanding the research and particularly the published literature behind our product, which is compressed salt. And it began in 2016 when our first publication was published in the Journal of Hospital Infection. And in that study, we did a head-to-head test against our pieces of salt with pieces of copper, which is known also to have these antimicrobial abilities. However, it's much, much slower than our compressed salt pieces. And in this first study, we did a head-to-head test with the antibiotic-resistant bacteria, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or MRSA, or MRSA, which is a pretty scary superbug. And what we noticed was we would have this 99% reduction in the bacteria after it was on our surface in just a few minutes, in less than 5 minutes. And in most cases, this was less than 2 minutes. Whereas with the pieces of copper, you don't even start noticing a reduction until, 30 minutes to an hour. And currently, the regulatory claim that copper has is actually this 99.9% reduction over the course of 2 hours, which we've always said isn't good enough when it comes to preventing the spread of pathogens on surfaces, because, most fixtures and things we're going to come in contact with, you can't wait 2 to 24 hours between touches to actually have that effect. And then one of the next papers that came out dealing with sodium chloride and these different efficacy features was actually another professor at the university, kind of unrelated to us, looked at impregnating salt in fabrics, particularly surgical masks. And this was a paper published in 2017, and he looked at influenza virus. And when influenza virus was exposed to these crystals of salt, what happened? And he showed that you could have complete inactivation of the influenza virus in about 5 minutes with using just salt crystals. And he actually showed, using this technique called microscopy, exactly how the virus was essentially getting killed, even though viruses aren't technically living organisms. But what it displayed was this process called recrystallization. So essentially what we see is typically a virus or a bacteria is encased in some sort of water droplet on the really microscopic level. And what happened is when it comes in contact with some salt, just a very little bit of salt dissolves when that moisture comes in contact with it, and then very rapidly dries, kind of recrystallizing, and in a very violent process, physically tearing apart the influenza virus and other types of pathogens like that. And so it really shows just how strong and powerful salt can be as this antimicrobial additive. And then fast forward to 2020, where we worked on our next publication, which was completely done in-house with our company. We wanted to improve kind of the testing methods when it came to these types of touch surfaces. And we actually developed our own method for this, which involved actually providing this new technique, which was essentially a scrape and wash method to ensure that you're correctly getting all of the bacteria off of the little test surface. And then we actually incubated the pieces, both of salt and copper and a control, which was just a plastic, to ensure that you've removed all of the pathogen on the surface. And we were able to then, through a dilution method, actually quantify a 99.9% reduction at the 2-minute time point, which is a really important number. And we want to continue to actually push this time point as quick as we can and demonstrate that with some of this data. And that paper was published in Scientific Reports and came out in the first part of this year in January of 2021. One of the more exciting pieces of research that we have ongoing right now is research into the novel coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, and its effects on our product. And this was a research partnership formed with the University of Alberta here where we are in Edmonton, and a great virology team. And we actually won some funding through a grant Roche Canada provided back in the first part of the pandemic, which was really exciting that we could get this research underway. Now, the paper that the virology team put out is currently sitting in peer review. So it's not released just yet, but we're hoping that this paper will be released in the coming month or so, at which point we're going to be able to publicly discuss some of those results. But we do have, of course, that paper a couple of years ago that showed influenza virus. So we've been very confident that there's going to be substantial efficacy with SARS-CoV-2. So we'll be sure to keep you folks updated when that paper gets released. So this is an image that we love sharing, especially in these presentation formats. So I just walk you through it a little bit. So what we see across the top is a Petri dish that had stamped this little square pieces of material, including our salt, which is compressed sodium chloride, our CSC, along the top. We did head-to-head with a piece of stainless steel, which has no antimicrobial ability, a piece of copper, which has a bit of antimicrobial ability, and then as well plastic, just as another control. And we inoculated each of these surfaces with the same amount of bacteria. And then what we did was we took a stamp with a contact plate, which mimics a touch from a pretty high efficiency source, at really rapid time points. So as quick as 2 seconds, which really the only reason we took 2 seconds was that's about as fast as hands can move in the lab from placing the bacteria on to quickly stamping it. And then up to 5 seconds, 10 seconds, all the way up to 10 minutes. And each of these little dots that you see is a colony forming unit of bacteria. Now, even though these ones look bigger on our CSC, that actually is an indication that there are less colonies, whereas these other pieces, which are full of these really tiny dots and can actually make the outline of a full square surface, that's representative of a lot of different colonies that can't grow very large because there are so many of them. And what's really cool is we can actually now visualize how fast acting pieces of salt are compared to these other surfaces, and how even between the 2 to 10 and 30-second time points, bacteria get reduced to countable numbers. And then after the 2 and 10-minute time point, the surface is effectively clear of bacteria. We actually can't identify with counting these colonies how many are left. And then, of course, we see stainless steel, copper, and plastic are indistinguishable. There seems to be no noticeable reduction of these bacteria over that time point. So a portion of this was actually published in that paper that came out earlier this year. So we are a resident company at the Health Accelerator space from the university in downtown Edmonton. This is just a shot of our lab and the type of research that we're able to do. And a lot of it is done really simply with these little square pieces of salt that I held up just a moment ago. Now I'll walk through just a few of these basically prototypes that we have and explaining the different use cases, because this is one of the most exciting parts about our company is the number of applications that salt can have in this way. This isn't going to be a single product that only has one type of use. We actually have the ability to manipulate salt in a way that you can make it pretty much any shape, size, or color. So this is just in one of our early prototypes of a standard door lever, which is where a lot of our research and prototyping is focused, just as a really common high touch surface. If you walk into most public buildings, there's not a ton of things you're going to touch that other people have, but in most cases, a door handle is going to be one of those items. And this is just a white cylinder that kind of slides over the top of it, which allows existing hardware to kind of be retrofitted with a piece of salt. This is just an example of a sliding touch plate that we see, of course, in a lot more commercial buildings where you're going to have swinging doors. This one just represents really a small rectangular piece that we allow to slide in over top. And then, of course, you use that as your contact point. This is just an image with a couple different colors of salt to really show some of that versatility. So this yellow piece is actually a simple push pad that we had piloted with our local transit service here in Edmonton. So we had formed a partnership earlier this year with the city of Edmonton and Edmonton Transit Service, where we implemented these yellow push plates in transit centers across the city on the swinging doors to get them into the real world and collect some data on how these products work and how people interact with them, which is really exciting and a really well-received pilot locally. We got a lot of media attention through it. It was a really exciting time, especially because in these public settings, people want to know and want the institutions to be demonstrating how they're keeping us safe from touching the same surfaces or interacting with different folks. And of course, we see that on a much larger scale with restrictions in different jurisdictions across the world. And on the right side of the screen is also just a gray color that was added to mimic a stainless steel. So again, we don't have to go with a classic, you might think of white salt or a pink salt, but we can make it look closer to stainless steel so it kind of seamlessly blends in while providing those antimicrobial abilities. Of course, this is just an example. We all know how swinging doors work. One of the areas for future research that we want to develop is actually implementing sodium chloride with different types of surfaces. This is an example of something we're working on developing, which is a flexible application, right? And this will just increase the versatility of applying it to different surfaces quite exponentially. It's analogous to something like a slip-resistant tape that you might see. So that is in early stages of development, but represents, of course, a number of ways that you can use these sodium chloride crystals to our benefit of killing these harmful pathogens. This is just a shot of a variety of our prototypes, both on the cylinder side and, of course, that push plate. So you can, of course, reach us at our website, outbreaker.ca, send us a note, sign up for our newsletter to kind of keep up to date, especially when some of our exciting research comes out. So that's just a quick overview of some of that research and some of our prototypes and what we're working on.
Wow, that's brilliant. I do actually have a few questions that
Sure.
I was noting down listening to that. Just at the top of my list was the color of it. That looks really interesting. How's the color actually added without reducing the efficacy of the salt? Or is that a trade secret?
Yeah, no, really good question. So we actually add the salt in the phase before we actually compress it to form the shape. Mm-hmm. So we use food grade coloring agents, and it's quite surprising that the volume of color required to make a push plate like that, it's less than 0.5% of the total weight is the coloring agent. So we're still hitting, 99.5% mm-hmm. salt. So that's, and of course in the lab, we take the pieces that are colored and test them and see no difference in that efficacy.
Okay, brilliant. How do you clean the door handles? I mean, I know, or I understand that it's antimicrobial, antibacterial in its own right, but would you not get like marks on the white ones from people's hands, dirty hands? So how would you clean that?
Yeah, no, and a great question that can happen, of course, in any type of setting. One of the benefits of this type of product is it's just essentially salt layered on top of salt. And when you take something like any type of cleaning rag, a cloth, a paper towel, whatever you might do, you're actually removing just a tiny, tiny, tiny layer of salt, which physically removes whatever might be dirty on the surface. And this is one of those features of the product that kind of separate it from other types of coatings or additives, because as you remove that layer that might be a little dirty or somebody's marked it up, what's below is just more active ingredient, sodium chloride. So although, yes, it will be dirty just like any other type of surface, as you clean it and as it very, very slowly wears down, it's essentially recharging itself, if I can use that term.
Is there any products that you can't use on it to clean it? Or do you just use water? How do you clean it?
Yeah, we did some internal kind of compatibility tests with some pretty strong hospital grade cleaning wipes and things like that. And we did that both to assess, are there any odd effects that might happen if a certain type of chemical comes in contact with it, but also we then measured how fast that degradation of the surface is. So we see that there's no weird effects. There's no toxic off effects that come from using any types of chemicals. Salt is very inert in that way. There's not a lot that in this form negatively interacts with it. And then the kind of pleasant surprise was that even when exposed, like a little test piece that I've held up a few times, even when exposed to like 1,000 wipes, it's less than a millimeter gets worn down of the product. So that compression just changes these properties so much that it's much closer in feel to a ceramic. These pieces that I have, on my desk that we see, in the slideshow, they're smooth to the touch. It doesn't feel grainy. You'd really have no idea it was salt unless somebody tells you so.
Is it brittle at all? Like if you drop that handle, would it break?
It depends. So the larger shapes, something like this that might be, it's not currently on a handle like this piece of product. It would be. It's closer to a ceramic in that sense. But the compression does provide a surprising amount of strength. So something like this, if it drops on a hard surface, might crack or chip away, but on softer surfaces, it does not. One of the ways that we get around having, weaknesses in the product when installed is, so this is a handle prototype that was developed for us by a door hardware company, and the actual internal mechanism for the salt is actually, or for the handle is still a stainless steel handle. So there's the integrity and the strength of the handle itself is maintained, and there's no weak point between, exposed salt being yanked in a direction that might break it.
So would you have to be careful with what you fitted that to? So you couldn't fit the handle onto a material that might potentially corrode from salt?
Yeah, corrosion, of course, one of those things that we've got to be careful with. In this instance, we're using stainless steel, but we also go kind of a step further, and this piece actually has on the inside of the salt cylinder a piece of plastic, which provides basically this little tiny layer of insulation between the salt, because we will see that, of course, over time. That's just the nature of salt and sodium chloride in that way. But when we provide that like barrier, whether it's a thin piece of tape of some sort of fabric, it prevents it. Like this prototype has been around for a few years and not seeing any type of corrosion.
So you're saying you can pretty much mold any shape. So that might even open doors to things like reception desks and things like that, where lots of people come and touch it. Or do you do taps or toilet flush buttons and things like that?
Yeah, those, again, speaking to all the different types of applications we can go after. The countertop, tabletop is something that's coming up. I'm finding even more and more, which is really interesting. I think people are wanting that constant germ killing action. Yeah, we can. Especially when it comes to compression, you could use a tiled approach because you would need fairly sizable hydraulic presses to make something the size of a classic desk. But using a tiled format where pieces can fit together, even form certain types of designs, could actually get some really great aesthetic looks from it as well. And other types of, like in those, something like a sink, of course, the drawback with something like that is if it's going to be constantly exposed to moisture and wet hands, it will dissolve away quicker than if it was just dry. So we do try to balance recommending that something like this would be in an area that's going to be constantly exposed to moisture.
Sure. I mean, it's all very exciting to hear how much research is going into this, and it can only be positive for the halotherapy industry, seeing how the results are coming back and how it kills off the viruses. I think that's a really important kind of factor for us. So we'll definitely be watching your progression as things go, and would love to stay up to date. We really appreciate you taking the time to share the product with us, and we look forward to the launch when it hits the market. I think there could well be some salt rooms out there that might be interested in applying these handles and materials to their salt rooms.
Absolutely. That would be a great market, because we always love talking to people who are really passionate and love salt as much as we do.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Matt. If we have any questions, we'll pass those on to you. But as you mentioned before, jump onto their website if you want to find out more and keep up to date.